Both of the images you're looking at were prompted by the search term wholesome. The one on the left was produced by DALL-E, an AI image generator. It depicts a white family with heterosexual parents and little kids and a picnic basket with what appear to be fruits and vegetables. The image on the right is by a photographer named Sydney Sang. I found it on the free stock photo website Pexels, and it depicts two young women, one black, one white. They both have absolutely perfect skin and authentic, unforced smiles with dimples and crinkly eyes. They are embracing cheek to cheek with a blanket draped over them in what appears to be a kind of heart shape. And they're looking at the camera with a kind of mischievous look of a shared secret. And all of this implies a tender and loving romantic relationship between them. So how do these images both represent the word wholesome? For many people, these two images might represent a significant divergence in values. When my parents, that is to say, my average students or viewers' grandparents were young, these were not compatible values as they are today in mainstream media in the United States and similar weird countries. Weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, developed. The 1970s saw an upsurge in advocacy for same-sex and interracial romantic relationships. But outside of progressive urban enclaves, both of these kinds of relationships were either disapproved of or not even spoken of as a possibility, so out of the mainstream they were. So what does the juxtaposition of these two images have to do with changes in the meaning of the word wholesome? Well, let's have a look at the definition. Wholesome. Adjective. Good for one's health or well-being. 2. Having or suggesting good health, behavior, and morals. And these are distinct meanings. And as a subset of meaning 2, we have the recent addition, arousing pleasant and usually sentimental feelings, endearing. An example of this last meaning is an online post on Twitter, now known as X. This was both so wholesome and funny. It is so sweet to see how much they care about each other and how they treat one another just like family. At Evane on Twitter. What we see is a semantic change or shift in progress. Semantic change is a form of language change regarding the evolution of the word usage, usually to the point that the modern meaning is radically different from the original usage, and it's only in progress here. It's not completed. More famous examples of semantic change including nice, which meant foolish or silly in Shakespeare's time. Gay, which of course used to mean carefree and happy. And actually the shift from gay meaning happy to gay as in, homosexual, not straight, meant in the early 20th century, gay was a person who liked to party and have a good time. So that's how that shifted over. Awesome is another example. It used to mean awe-inspiring in a kind of a religious or philosophical sense, not just another word for, cool. The semantic shift I'm discussing today in the word wholesome is essentially that meaning to see arousing pleasant and usually sentimental feelings, endearing, has become the prevalent one among young people in the last decade. By the way, I looked for this tweet and couldn't find it. Maybe this person deleted their account because Twitter isn't a very wholesome place anymore. But before I analyze that phenomenon, let's take a look at the prior history of the word wholesome. Wholesome is etymologically related to healthy. The first stem, whole, comes from Old English hal, which means healthy. We get from this word not just wholesome, but healthy, hail, hello, holy, and hail. It meant intact, free from wound or injury, unharmed, in good health. It could also was a salutation. And we see a similar thing in the Romance Latin root salus, which means both health and healthy, but is also related to the word salute, salutation, right? Salud means like health, literally. Be healthy, right? Big pandemic energy there. But the past was full of pandemics. That which is wholesome is also conducive to physical well-being. And the sum in Old English, that end is a derivational suffix. That is, we use it to tack onto nouns and adjectives to form other adjectives. Such modern forms using this stem include lonesome, winsome, handsome, buxom, you might not know it from the spelling, but that spelling changed over time, cumbersome, loathsome, awesome, And some obsolete versions of words using the stem include darksome, brightsome, healthsome, I spelled that wrong, and cuddlesome, which sounds pretty wholesome. All right, so let's talk about the history of the word wholesome. And here I'm not going to Merriam-Webster. I am going to the Oxford English Dictionary, which is like an archaeology dictionary. It tells you the history of a word over time. It was first used, or our first written record of it was in a weird text called the Ormulum by Orm, written in England in the late 1100s, which is a big sort of devotional treatise. And we see the phrase, Sant Johannes, not me, that's St. John, Sant Johannes Fuchtning was wholesome and God to fangen. So St. John was really wholesome and ready to go, I think. Good to begin, I'm not sure. Then riseth o'er Helland on his herta and teacheth him wholesome lore from 1200. This is a homily, which is a sermon. And it says, then rises our Savior on his heart and teaches wholesome lore, right? Good for our salvation. There's that sense of health, association of health with morality. Fast forward a couple hundred years, in March, water is nicht well wholesome and to drinka. And here it's a very literal meaning. That water's not healthy to drink. It is not wholesome with gods to play, says John Lydgate in 1439. In Puritan times, we have a good example of wholesome severity. And then in Victorian times, we have the sober and wholesome manners of life among the early Romans had given them vigorous minds and vigorous bodies. I cannot imagine a more Victorian sentence than this one from 1879. More recently, we have try the healthy and wholesome ramen noodles and delicious broths, and Dick Clark's faithful assembly of wholesome white teenagers out there in Archie Comics land. And here we again we have that contrast or that juxtaposition or the joining of vigorous minds and vigorous bodies. There's a sense in which health entails both. The cultural connection between morality, health, and emotion is ancient, but the nature of this connection has always been debated. The idea of health and healthy is an essentially contested concept, a meaning that is fought over in the culture by different communities and sets of values. The philosopher W.B. Galley wrote a paper on essentially contested concepts, and he argued that these are complex value judgments where most people agree on the general value, but disagree on how the value is realized or achieved. These include such concepts as justice, fairness, democracy, and art, freedom, etc. It is possible and rational, he argued, to discuss one's justifications for holding one interpretation over competing ones, but one could never say that there was a conclusive and final definition. I believe that in the word health, there is a contest between two competing but related core ideas. Health as purity, which has a legal and moral dimension to it, versus health as functionality, which is more of a therapeutic dimension to it. And the hostility of conservatives towards therapy and therapeutic culture is pretty old, because it represents a sort of alternate take on morality. But in the semantic shift from the first to the second image, the semantic shift in the word wholesome, I will argue that we can see an encapsulation of some core concepts animating the culture war that rages in the United States and everywhere, that ideas about self-actualization, sexuality, and mental health that were radical 40 years ago are becoming widely accepted by the young and hyper-connected. You're watching Language, Culture, and Literature. In this linguistic word study video, I'm discussing shifts in the meaning of the English adjective wholesome over the last 20 years. And to do this, I'll be using ideas from critical theory and cultural studies as well as linguistics. My purpose here is both to investigate what the recent career of this very old word tells us about our present-day culture, and also to use it as a case study to illustrate how several ways of thinking about linguistic meaning, how it changes, and how it reflects wider cultural practices and beliefs. On YouTube, I go by the pretentious handle of Johannes Rhetor, which just means John, the language arts teacher. But in real life, I'm Associate Professor Jonathan Newman of Missouri State University's Department of English, which means I get to work in this cool-ass building. Now, my main area of expertise is medieval literature, which, as you can see here, is serious business. And studying texts from the Middle Ages means you need to study languages and how they change over time. For this reason, it's often the medievalist in an English department who teaches history of the English language, and so this is where I plug my video series on that topic. Check it out. It's about 20 to 30 hours of content that you'll just learn so much. Anyway, the study of language change over time is called historical linguistics. And historical linguistics is the systematic study of the genealogy of language. For example, how Latin became French, Spanish, Romanian, Portuguese, the causes of language change, the predictable patterns of language change, and the connection between language and culture over time. And while historical linguistics is not my primary area of study, it's a strong secondary area. Secondary area, that's a mouthful. But not only do I study the Middle Ages, I am myself middle-aged. And one of the fun things about being middle-aged is that I've now lived long enough to experience the effects of language change in my own lifetime. This is one of the reasons I'm so interested in new slang. It's not just a morbid desire to stay relevant. Yes, I know this meme is extremely old. Look, I was there when memes were born. Anyway, as a college professor, I get to spend time around young people and take note of their changing language. The internet also gives us dinosaurs a window through which we can continuously misunderstand youth culture while we surveil and continually attempt to file new things into the broken old containers in our declining brains. Oh hey, a Simpsons reference. He is middle-aged. Alright. Let me give you a few basic terms from historical linguistics to help you understand language change and how linguists think about it. There is one essential component to language change. People have to start saying new things, or old things, in new ways. This is called linguistic innovation, and slang is one obvious example of the phenomenon. But linguistic innovation also includes shifts in the meaning of older words, shifts in pronunciation, and shifts in grammatical forms. And it's also worth pointing out that non-standardized forms of a language, such as African American Vernacular English, Jamaican Patois, or Parisian Argot, that generate innovation. And it's likely that slang is often stigmatized because of its association with stigmatized groups. I'm setting aside that sociolinguistic topic right now. That's probably a good topic for another video. Let's not go chasing too many rabbits here. What slang illustrates is that most innovations disappear almost as quickly as they appear, like gene mutations. New slang happens constantly, but it doesn't all stick. If you happen to be watching this video in 2026, there's a good chance that the language on this mug, this coffee is straight bussin', for real. Any MF who makes coffee that slaps this hard is high key, not mid, no cap. If you're watching this in 2026, there's a chance the language on this mug is hilariously dated. Because for every word, like cool, that becomes so pervasive people stop even thinking of it as slang, there are dozens of forgotten innovations that never became embedded in the language. I'm looking at you, Epic. I'm just going to say I haven't heard anyone say epic in at least 5 years, with the possible exception of the Minecraft YouTuber Gemini Tay, who says it so much for so many reasons that it's practically part of her brand. Anyway, to sum up, innovation is not sufficient for language change in large-scale speech communities. In order for the innovation to stick, it needs to be propagated. Propagation is the transmission, diffusion, and adoption in language of new words, grammatical forms, etc. After all, My families and friend group make up their own private little words, phrases, and codes all the time, and I've seen the word familect used to describe this. But if these private words remain private, they cannot be said to be causing language change. As I said before, language doesn't always change through the introduction of new words. Sometimes our old words are repurposed. For example, cool and the less successful epic originally had more specific and tightly defined meanings. In the last few years, the word wholesome has captured my interest by both its increase in usage and by the change in how it's used, especially among younger people and online. What we have here is the Google Ngram Viewer, which is a kind of a statistical analysis tool that examines the frequency of a word in a language relative to all the other words in the language. And we can see an overall decline in the 20th century in the usage of the word wholesome. It was not a very wholesome century, I think we can all agree, till it flattens out in around 1980, and then there's an uptick around 2000. And let's just zoom in a little bit more here and decrease our scale. We can see an increase through 2006, flattens out, and then drops down again around 2012 when it starts to pick up again. And now, this last section here, from around 2012 to the present, is when we have seen these sudden and decisive changes in the prevalent meaning of the word. So, Merriam-Webster, by the way, is a subsidiary of the Encyclopedia Britannica Corporation, and if there was ever a private company I would do sponsored content for, it is them. Hit me up, you know where I'm at. Anyway, when I was growing up in what young people call the late 1900s, when they want to hurt anyone older than 35, wholesome was much more connected to meaning one, good for one's health or well-being. Wholesome was, in my experience, mostly an adjective connected to food, like granola and stuff like that. But in the last few years, I have noticed a marked shift to meaning to, and especially to see, meaning arousing pleasant and usually sentimental feelings. What I'm curious about is this. How did this change take place? And what does it mean to our culture generally and to the young and online specifically who seek out wholesome content? Not surprisingly, I'm not the first person with a humanities degree to notice this. We've seen coverage in the New York Times, the Daily Beast, Vox, and BuzzFeed, which has a whole category of wholesome content. There is the subreddit r/wholesome memes, and you'll find wholesome memes everywhere. In a 2019 article for Vox, a journalist named Constance Grady charted the shift of the term away from an association with white bread, middle American, evangelical culture and the purity movement of the aughts. Purity rings, daddy-daughter dances, vacation Bible school. Maybe that accounts for that first little bump during the George W. Bush years. Grady argues that wholesomeness as we're using it now means friends supporting friends. It means valuing kindness. It means not judging simple pleasures. And while just a few short years ago, wholesomeness might have suggested a regressive nostalgia for the 1950s, today's wholesomeness is determinedly progressive. If we're going to have wholesome family values, the thinking seems to be they're damn well going to be diverse and multicultural wholesome family values. And she talks extensively about a Honey Maid commercial in 2014 that featured a gay family. Grady argues that the term wholesome sheds its associations with moral policing and restriction and doubled down on its association with sincerity, kindness, and friends and family supporting and accepting each other right around the time in the early 20s when internet culture took a turn towards poisonous irony and hatred as the misogyny and racism of sites like 4chan oozed through other platforms. There's also was a movement of wholesome trolling, for example. There was a racist subreddit called Race Realism, which was taken over by people who started writing about car racing. And so there was this kind of kind of bombing kind of these nasty sites with what was considered more wholesome content. And wholesome was the term that became attached to this kind of accepting, welcoming, progressive content. And so we get several semantic shifts involved. Since journalists have already given the expository hot take on this phenomenon, I'm going to offer an academic take with a bit of systematic and semiotic analysis. That's to say, I'm going to examine the shift in terms of how meaning works as a system. We can see three semantic shifts in this adaptation of wholesome: object to subject, approval to acceptance, and distinction to connection. This is my analysis. Let me explain it a little bit more. Wholesomeness no longer describes an object of consumption like food, like milk or granola, or media artifacts like Leave It to Beaver or the Waltons, but the emotion that it evokes in the consumer. Wholesomeness is about a subjective experience, not a thing that's out there in the world. And so we get a switch in its meaning from object to subject. We also get a shift from approval. It is no longer a term that connotes judgment and approval. This activity is wholesome enough and it poses no danger to our youth. Instead, we shift to acceptance. Wholesomeness entails acceptance of something or someone as they are without judgment. We also have a shift, I think, from distinction to connection. Wholesomeness is no longer associated with a kind of purity defined by moral authority of traditional religion and patriarchy, a judgment based on a primitive distinction between pure and impure, clean and unclean that goes back to the Bronze Age, at least. Rather, wholesomeness is connected to empathy and acceptance and entails feelings of connection and identification. There is, however, one media artifact that comes to mind for me that encompasses both definitions of the word wholesome, the older and the newer. And this is VeggieTales. Now, the media has a well-known negativity bias, and coverage of young people on the internet and social media platforms will focus on extremism like Andrew Tate cultists and cruel stunts from TikTok like pernicious nips or dibs or whatever it was called, where they were breaking bathrooms. But the simple fact is that Gen Z, and I use this term carefully because I kind of disagree with a lot of the generational discourse, but that's a topic for another video too. The simple fact is that Gen Z is the most educated and diverse generation in the history of the United States. And young people do seem to have a culture of compassion, of grace, with respect to, for example, disability, mental health, the whole spectrum of human difference. Young people are usually the motor of innovation in language. If you followed my series of shorts on slang in the 20th century, you'll notice that slang, which is to say the invention or repurposing of words, almost always reflects and represents the experience of young people, dating, forms of entertainment, military service, entry-level work. The only thing that makes Gen Z, and really younger millennials as well, distinct in this respect is the hyperconnectivity of this generation through various online platforms. At the time I am making this video, TikTok is still preeminent among the young. Now, the antonym, which is to say the opposite of wholesome, what is that? Let's say that it's toxic. Behaviors, environments, or relationships that are harmful, negative, or emotionally draining. The fact that wholesome has emerged in this new sense almost simultaneously as the term toxic has taken off, and this is really since like 2012, 2013, like peak Tumblr, this can be taken as evidence for a structuralist theory of meaning. In other words, our minds, culture, and language make meaning through systems of differences, of binary oppositions, dark and light, male and female, hot and cold, clean and dirty, etc. Every term requires its opposite in order for it to gain its meaning. The dependence of each term on its opposite, to the extent that we can see the idea of cleanness generating the idea of dirtiness and vice versa, which destabilizes the distinction between them, is one of the key ideas of deconstruction. There is a dim awareness of this concept in the popular political idea of horseshoe theory, of binary opposites containing their counterparts. So, to what extent does wholesome contain the toxic within it? The turn towards the wholesome was a reaction to a culture fixated on grime, darkness, violence, sleaze, extrajudicial violence, torture. But that was when, at least in the United States, our culture had the putative figureheads of George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And, despite extraordinary rendition sites, Google it, drone wars, and increasing surveillance, which we now don't even think about anymore, in their respective ways, both of these presidents, these symbolic figureheads of our culture, had very wholesome kind of affects, appearances, public self-representations. Now, Bush had a kind of say your prayers and thank the troops sort of wholesomeness, whereas Obama's had more of an eat your vegetables and recycle wholesomeness. But these are just red and blue flavors of a performative wholesomeness linked to cleanliness and virtue. Say what you will about the policies of Trump, he never pretended to be wholesome, which was part of his appeal. But when that kind of toxic edginess that made him a hero to what I think people used to call edgelords, I don't know if people say that anymore, young people largely abandoned that edginess to the boomers on Facebook and embraced wholesomeness. But the wheel will turn. Wholesomeness will once again be cringe. Toxic will be cool when toxic energy is needed to burn away a fossilized and false wholesomeness that masks harm and injustice. And maybe I'm saying this as a Gen Xer here, which that kind of irony of the late 80s and early 90s was really in reaction to the kind of like therapeutic self-help, like health food culture of boomers after they had moved out of a kind of publicly engaged phase and turned inward into a kind of like new age kind of spirituality, which felt false in combination with the intense materialism of that period. So, I don't know. Culture's always changing. Values are always changing. I just went on a bit of a digression there. A simpler way to put this: when does the sweetness of wholesome become too much? When does it start to feel forced and fake, or as people used to call it, saccharin, an artificial sweetener your grandparents used to use a lot before the cancer scare in the 1970s and aspartame took over. Anyway, since I am a middle-aged person, when I notice a phenomenon among youth culture, it's probably already past its relevance, and by the time you're watching this, maybe wholesome is already cringe, or whatever you're saying instead of cringe, since cringe is now cringe. I'm not going to get started on cringe right now. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you found this wholesome. Thank you for listening. If you would like to support more content that combines critical theory with contemporary language use and cultural ephemera, like and subscribe. And please let me know your thoughts in the comments section. Finally, I'd like to thank Suda, who runs a Wordle game channel, for inviting me on to play with him and getting me a whole bunch of new subscribers, and Endlessly Tired, who in the comments section of that video commented about me. He's so wholesome, which got me thinking about wholesome. So Endlessly Tired, you were the inspiration of this video. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.